Welcome to the Walk-Ins Podcast. We are a United Methodist Church located in Louisville, Kentucky. On this podcast, you'll hear a selection of messages, interviews, and more with one of our pastors. If you're ever around the area, please be sure to stop by and say hi, or visit our website at walkinsumc.com. Now, I hope you'll enjoy today's episode.
What does home mean to you? What images come to your mind? Is home a place? Maybe it's a city or a building or a street. Perhaps it's an object that you love, or maybe it's the couch that you move from place to place. Is it a person or pet that you love? Could it be a chosen family? There was this great TED Radio Hour with host Guy Raz, who is one of my favorite podcasters, and he interviewed a guy named Pico Iyer. Pico Iyer is an essayist and novelist known chiefly for his travel writing. In the podcast, Guy Raz asked Pico, "What is home like for you?" And Pico has a complicated home definition. He says, his blood is 100% from India, but he's never lived there a day in his life. If home is where you were born, raised, and educated, well, England could be his home, but right after he finished undergrad, he left. If home is where you pay your taxes or where you see your doctor, your dentist, then perhaps he's from the United States, where he was there for over 50 years. He now lives in Japan. But for many of the years in the United States, he had to carry a little card that identified him as a permanent alien. Guy Raz asked this beautiful, poignant question about it all. Is home where you find your identity, or is your identity your home? And Pico Iyer responds with this beautiful phrase. I would say that my home is where I find my identity, where I create my identity, which is an ongoing phenomenon. I love that. Home is where you find your identity and create your identity. For me, home is safety and security, comfortability, but also a place to find myself surrounded by those I love. You see, I found the United Methodist Church as a college student longing for home. I was a first-year music student at Florida Southern College, go Mocs, and I was invited to play in the worship band for their chapel services. It was in there, the Annie Pfeiffer Chapel, that I found the United Methodist Church as my denominational home. See, how would you characterize the United Methodist? What words or phrases would you use? If someone off the streets didn't know anything about United Methodism, or maybe perhaps what they read in the newspaper the last couple of years, which would not be great, what would you say to them? I asked my Wednesday night class this last week, and they came up with some words, and I wonder if they resonate with you. The first one was inclusive. And they were really noting at the open table here, where, as we say in our communion liturgy, this is not my table, the pastor's table. It's not the church's table. It's not the United Methodist table. It is God's table, and all are welcome to this space. They also listed grace as a priority, that we're mission-driven, that United Methodists were known for building hospitals and colleges and youth homes and retirement care, being a place that is an accepting denomination where discussion is not only open, but is really encouraged, a place of great hymns, of this great combination of love of God and love of neighbor, and that we're not only listeners, but we are doers. And I thought that was a really great list. And I think if that's all people knew about the United Methodist Church, I would say we'd be a completely different space than we are now. I think it would be enough to make folks interested in what's going on in these walls and what's going on for the people who call themselves United Methodist. So how did we get to this place? That didn't just happen overnight. See, John Wesley was an English theologian in the 1700s. He was born in England to Samuel and Susanna Wesley, and they were all faithful members of the Church of England. John would go on to become educated at Christ Church, Oxford, and ordained an Anglican priest a few years after graduation. At Oxford, he founded a society called the Holy Club, which was formed to study and to help others in their Christian walk. He had a brother named Charles, who was a great hymn writer, of course, and early on, they traveled to Savannah, Georgia, where they pastored a newly formed church. And it's in Savannah where they met a group of Moravian settlers who influenced John Wesley by their deep faith and spirituality. He desired to have an interfaith just like they did. And after a few years, after what people call pretty much a failed mission, they returned to England. And John became pretty depressed after his Georgia experience, and then he had this great awakening of sorts called the Aldersgate experience, Whereas he heard a reading of Martin Luther's preface to the Epistle to the Romans, he felt his heart strangely warmed. And after that experience, John Wesley seemed unstoppable. To many, but not to all. Early on, he was banned from preaching just like his friend George Whitefield, and so they both took up open-air preaching. John Wesley said this felt vile and gross, but he did it because that's where the people were. And along the way, they founded the first Methodist chapel called the Foundry, and within the structure of the Methodist movement was class meetings, and they were governed by this set of general rules, all which would make up the beginning of our Book of Discipline even today. And John Wesley emphasized a lot in his sermons in those years, but the underpinning of all of it was grace. Grace was the glue that held it all together. And I believe that is why we are here today. If United Methodists were to plant our flag into anything, I believe it would be in grace. And this grace is God's gift to us. See, grace in the Book of Discipline is defined as this: the undeserved, unmerited, and loving action of God in human existence through the ever-present Holy Spirit. You know, there's not much I would describe as beautiful in our Book of Discipline, but I would say that phrase is. And that grace is everywhere. That grace is given freely, that wherever God is present, which is everywhere, there is grace. You know, and for John Wesley, there was this kind of threefold movement of grace, and I'll put it just briefly, you can Google this later on. It's much like a house. A house that has that big wide front porch, right? I love good open front porches, those wraparound ones with the rocking chairs, and that's prevenient grace. That before you even enter into the house, before you can acknowledge who God is and utter the words, Jesus Christ as Lord and Savior, God is already working in a beautiful way in your life. That God is continuing to show you grace, even before you even utter a word. And then as you go, you enter into the door and you turn that doorknob and you walk on that doormat and on the front of the page of the door, it says all are welcome. And then when you open that door and step through, that is justifying grace. That doorway and that process of walking through it. And then as you walk through and become in right relationship with God, as you come and surrender your life to all God's movement and love, then you walk through each doorway, you walk through the long, expansive hallway, you walk through all the rooms into this ever-expansive dwelling of God's presence, and that would be called sanctifying grace. You see, I think United Methodists need to recover this. I think we have maybe strayed off the path of grace, that we have we've taken a U-turn, or we have taken a long road that was not supposed to be taken. And my question this past week that I've asked my congregation and many people in my life, is there any hope for return? And I would say yes. I wonder if it is this time that we are called to return to the gift of grace, that it's this time for a wandering, uncentered denomination to return to its first love. Bishop Ken Carter, in his book of the same title of this series, asks a question at the end of chapter 1 that asks if we are in need of a prodigal son moment. If we are in need of a prodigal son moment. You know that story. Its father has two sons, and younger son says, "Hey, Dad, I wish you were better off dead. Give me all my money. I'm on my way." So it goes off, and he wastes it on extravagant living. And when it's all gone, and he's grumbling with the pigs, and he's in need again, he returns to his father. And his father's moved with compassion, embraces him and throws him a big, beautiful party, right? The robes, the rings, the fattened calf, you know the story. And in the story, it's a story about how recklessly indulgent the father is. I mean, after he was better wished off dead, right? He welcomes him down, not with his head down, not through the back door, but welcomes him in what people would call probably foolish ways. And then it's also how this father is so ridiculous that no grown man in this time, no person of dignity would run out like this father does. But this father is just longing for his son's return, so he sprints. And before any words are exchanged, before an apology is given, a sprinting father is full of a warm embrace. It's ridiculous. Maybe even foolish. But I wonder if it's a God who is so eager to give and to restore that God won't hesitate to bless and restore any relationship. I think we need a prodigal son moment in our denomination. You see, Jesus is illustrating in that beautiful story that God's love goes way beyond human love as commonly understood and practiced. That Jesus continues to preach that through his life, that God's love surpasses all typical expressions known to humanity, that love is the restoration agent, and that is something to be celebrated. Henry Nouwen wrote this beautiful book called The Return of the Prodigal Son, and he writes this, and I think this is where we should end today. He says, "For most of my life, I've struggled to find God, to know God, and to love God. I've tried hard to follow the guidelines of the spiritual life, pray always, work for others, read the scriptures, and to avoid the many temptations to dissipate myself. I have failed many times, but always tried again, even when I was close to despair." He continues to say this, "Now I wonder whether I have sufficiently realized that during all this time, God has been trying to find me, to know me, and to love me. The question is not how am I to find God, but how am I to let myself be found by him? The question is not how am I to know God, but how am I to let myself be known by God? And finally, the question is not how am I to love God, but how am I to let myself be loved by God? God is looking to the distance for me, trying to find me, longing to bring me home." I don't know about you, but I look around, all around me, and I think this world is in some good news like that. That they are desperately in need to be known by God, desperately in need to surrender their lives to become loved, and to live into that love. I think they desperately need to hear a story that God is so full of love that a party breaks out every time a prodigal returns. Let's tell them that story. Let's acknowledge that there is a God who's already working for your good. Let's tell folks a story of grace that is so unrelentless that it stops at nothing to overflow with love. My friends, I think it's time to be embraced by grace and sent by grace. Grace and peace, my friends.